Ethics, if it is to be a science, and not a piece of arbitrary legislation, cannot pronounce a sinful and a serpent to be a serpent. It cannot even accuse a barbarian of loving a wrong life, except in so far as the barbarian is supposed capable of accusing himself of barbarism. If he is a perfect barbarian, he will be inwardly, and therefore morally, justified. The notion of a barbarian will then be accepted by him as that of a true man, and will form the basis of whatever rational judgments or policy he attains. It may still seem dreadful to him to be a servant, as to be a barbarian might seem dreadful to a man imbued with liberal interests. But the degree to which moral science, or the dialectical will, can condemn any type of life depends on the amount of disruptive contradiction which, at any reflective moment, the life brings under the unity of apperception. The discordant impulses, therein confronted, will challenge and condemn one another, and the court of reason, in which their quarrel is ventilated, will have authority pronounced between them. The physical repulsion, however, which everybody feels to habits and interests which he is incapable of sharing, is no part of rational estimation, large as its share may be in the fierce prejudices and superstitions which pre-rational morality abounds in. The strongest feelings assigned to the conscience are not moral feelings at all, they express merely physical antipathies. To what alien powers, a man's true weapon is not invective, but skill and strength. An obstacle is an obstacle, not a devil. And even in moral life, when it actually exists in a being with hostile activities, is merely a hostile power. It is not hostile, however, insofar as it is moral, but only insofar as this morality represents a material organism, physically incompatible with what the thinker has at heart. Material conflicts cannot be abolished by reason, because reason is powerful only where they have been removed. Yet where opposing forces are able mutually to comprehend and respect one another, common ideal interests at once supervene, and though the material conflict may remain irrepressible, it will be overlaid by an intellectual life, partly common and unanimous. In this lies the chivalry of war, that we acknowledge the right of others to pursue ends contrary to our own. Competitors who are able to feel this ideal comedy, and who, leading different lives in the flesh, lead the same life in imagination, are incited by the mutual understanding to rise above that material ambition, perhaps gratuitous, that has made them enemies. They may ultimately wish to renounce that temporal good which deprives them of spiritual goods, in truth, infinitely greater and more appealing to the soul: innocence, justice, and intelligence. They may prefer an enlarged mind to enlarged frontiers, and the comprehension of things foreign to the destruction of them. They may even aspire to detachment from those private interests which, as Plato said, do not deserve to be taken too seriously, and the fact that we must take them seriously being the ignoble part of our condition. Perhaps the art of politics, if it were practiced scientifically, might obviate open war, religious enmities, industrial competition, and human slavery, but it would certainly not leave a free field for all animals, nor for all monstrosities in men. There is tragedy in perfection, because the universe in which perfection arises is itself imperfect. Accidents will always continue to harness the most consummate organism. They will flow in both from the outer world and from the interstices, so to speak, of its own machinery, for rational life touches the irrational at its core as well as at its periphery. In both directions it meets physical force, and can subsist only by exercising physical force in return. The range of rational ethics is limited to the intermediate political zone, in which existences have attained some degree of natural unanimity. It should be added, perhaps, that the frontiers between moral and physical action are purely notional. Real existences do not lie wholly on one or the other side of them. Every man, every material object, has moral affinities enveloping an indomitable vital nucleus, or brute personal kernel. This moral essence is developed in turn by untraceable relations, radiating to infinity over the natural world. The stars enter society by the light and knowledge they afford, the time they keep, and the ornament they lavish. But they are more dead weights in their substance and cosmological puzzles in their destiny. You and I possess manifold ideal bonds in the interests we share, but each of us has his poor body and his irremediable, incommunicable dreams. Beyond the little span of his foresight and love, each is merely a physical agency, preparing the way quite irresponsibly for undreamt of revolutions and alien lives. A truly rational morality or social regimen has never existed in the world and is hardly to be looked for. What guides men and nations in their practice is always some partial interest or some partial disillusion. A rational morality would imply perfect self-knowledge, so that no congenial good should be needlessly missed, least of all, practical reason or justice itself, so that no good congenial to other creatures would be needlessly taken from them. The total value which everything had from the agent's point of view would need to be determined and felt efficaciously, and, among other things, the total value which this point of view, with the conduct it justified, would have for every foreign interest which it affected. Such knowledge, such definition of purpose, and such perfection of sympathy are clearly beyond man's reach. All that can be hoped for is that the advance of science and commerce, by fostering peace and rational development of character, may bring some part of mankind nearer to that goal. But the goal lies, as every ultimate ideal should, at the limit of what is possible. It must serve rather to measure achievements than to prophesy them. In lieu of a rational morality, however, we have rational ethics, and this mere idea of a rational morality is something valuable. While we wait for the sentiments, customs, and laws which should embody perfect humanity and perfect justice, we may observe the germinal principle of these ideal things. We may sketch the ground plan of a true commonwealth. This sketch constitutes rational ethics, as founded by Socrates, glorified by Plato, and sobered and solidified by Aristotle. It sets forth the method of judgment and estimation which a rational morality would apply universally and express in practice. The method, being very simple, can be discovered and largely illustrated in advance, while the complete self-knowledge and sympathy are still wanting which might avail to embody that method in the concrete and to discover unequivocally where absolute duty and ultimate happiness may lie. This method, the Socratic method, consists in accepting any estimation which any man may sincerely make, and in applying dialectic to it, so as to let the man see what he really esteems. What he really esteems is what ought to guide his conduct, for to suggest that a rational being ought to do what he feels to be wrong, or ought to pursue what he genuinely thinks is worthless, will be to impugn that man's rationality and to discredit one's own. With what face could any man or God say to another, "Your duty is to do what you cannot know you ought to do. Your function is to suffer what you cannot recognize to be worth suffering"? Such an attitude amounts to imposture and excludes society. It is the attitude of a detestable tyrant, and anyone who mistakes it for moral authority has not yet felt the first heartthrob of philosophy. More even than natural philosophy, moral philosophy is something Greek. It is the appanage of freemen. The Socratic method in the soul of liberal conversation is compacted in equal measure of sincerity and courtesy. Each man is autonomous, and all are respected, and nothing is brought forward except to be submitted to reason and accepted or rejected by the self-questioning heart. Indeed, when Socrates appeared in Athens, mutual respect had passed into democracy, and liberty into license. But the stalwart virtue of Socrates saved him from being a sophist, much as his method, when not honestly and sincerely used, might seem to countenance that moral anarchy which the sophist had expressed and their irresponsible doctrines. The sophism consisted in ignoring the living moment's intent, and in suggesting that no judgment could refer to anything ulterior, and therefore that no judgment could be wrong. In other words, that each man, at each moment, was the theme and standard, as well as the seat of his judgment. Socrates escaped this folly by force of honesty, which is what saves from folly in dialectic. He built his whole science precisely on that intent, which the sophists ignored. He insisted that people should declare sincerely what they meant and what they wanted, and on that living rock he founded the persuasive and ideal sciences of logic and ethics, the necessity of which lies all in free insight and an actual will. This will and insight they render deliberate, profound, unshakable, and consistent. Socrates, by his genial midwifery, helped men to discover the truth and excellence to which they were naturally addressed. This circumstance rendered his doctrine at once moral and scientific. Scientific because dialectical, moral because expressive of personal and living aspirations. His ethics was not like what has since passed under that name, a spurious physics, accompanied by commandments and threats. It was a pliant and liberal expression of ideals, inwardly grounded and spontaneously pursued. It was an exercise in self-knowledge. Socrates' liberality was that of a free man, ready to maintain his will and conscience, if need be, against the whole world. The sophists, on the contrary, were sycophants in their skepticism, and having inwardly abandoned the ideals of the race and nation, which Socrates defended with his homely irony, they dealt out their miscellaneous knowledge, or their talent in exposition, at the beck and for the convenience of others. Their theory was that each man, having a right to pursue his own aims, skillful thinkers might, for money, furnish any fellow mortal with instruments fitted to his purpose. Socrates, on the contrary, conceived that each man, to achieve his aims, must first learn to distinguish them clearly. He demanded that rationality, in the form of an examination and clarification of purposes, should precede any selection of external instruments. For how should a man recognize anything useful unless he first had established the end to be subserved, and thereby recognize the good? True science, then, was that which enabled a man to disentangle and attain his natural good. And such a science is also the art of life and the whole of virtue. The autonomous moralist differs from the sophist or ethical skeptic in this, that he retains his integrity. In vindicating his ideal, he does not recant his human nature. In asserting the initial right of every impulse in others, he remains a spokesman of his own. Knowledge of the world, courtesy, and fairness do not neutralize his positive life. He is thoroughly sincere, as the sophist is not. For every man, while he lives, embodies, and enacts some special interest, and this truth, which those who confound psychology with ethics may think destructive of all authority and morals, is in fact what alone renders moral judgment possible and respectable. If the sophist declares that what his nature attaches him to is not really a good, because it would not be a good, perhaps, for a different creature, he is a false interpreter of his own heart, and rather discreditably stultifies his honest feelings and actions by those theoretical valuations which, in guise of a mystical ethics, he gives out to the world. Socratic liberality, on the contrary, is consistent with itself, as Spinozistic naturalism is also. For it exercises that right of private judgment which it concedes to others, and avowedly builds up the idea of the good on that natural inner foundation on which everybody who has it at all must inevitably build it. This functional good is accordingly always relative, and good for something. It is the ideal which a vital and energizing soul carries with it as it moves. It is identical, as Socrates constantly taught, with the useful, the helpful, the beneficent. It is the complement needed to perfect every art and every activity after its own kind. Rational ethics is an embodiment of volition, not a description of it. It is the expression of living interest, preference, and categorical choice. It leaves to psychology and history a free field for the description of moral phenomena. It has no interest in slipping far-fetched and incredible myths beneath the facts of nature, so as to lend a non-natural origin to human aspirations. It even recognizes, as an emanation of its own force, that uncompromising truthfulness with which science assigns all forms of mortal life to their place in the automatic system of nature. But the rational moralist is not on that account reduced to a mere spectator, a physicist acknowledging no interest except the interest in facts and in the laws of change. His own spirit, small by the material forces which it may stand for and express, is great by its prerogative of surveying and judging the universe, surveying it, of course, from a moral point of view, and judging it only by its kindliness or cruelty to some actual interest. Yet, even so, determining unequivocally a part of its constitution and excellence. The rational moralist represents a force energizing in the world, discovering its affinities there, and clinging to them to the exclusion of their hateful opposites. He represents, over against the chance facts, an ideal embodying the particular demands, possibilities, and satisfactions of a specific being. This dogmatic position of reason is not uncritically dogmatic. On the contrary, it is a sophistical position that is uncritically neutral. All criticism needs a dogmatic background, else it would lack objects and criteria for criticism. The sophist himself, without confessing it, enacts a special interest. He bubbles over with convictions about the pathological and fatal origin of human beliefs, as if that could prevent some of them from being more trustworthy and truer than others. He is doubtless right in psychology. His own ideas have their natural causes and their chance of signifying something real. His skepticism may represent a wider experience than do the fanaticisms it opposes. But the skeptic also lives. Nature has sent her saps abundantly into him. He cannot but nod dogmatically on that philosophical tree on which he is so pungent a berry. His imagination is unmistakably fascinated by the pictures it happens to put together. His judgment falls unabashed, and his discourse splashes on in its dialectical march. Every stepping stone, an unquestioned idea, every stride, a categorical assertion. Does he deny this? Then his very denial, in its promptness and heat, audibly contradicts him and makes him ridiculous. Honest criticism consists in being consciously dogmatic, and conscientiously so. Like Descartes, when he said, I am. It is to sift and harmonize all assertions, so as to make them a faithful expression of actual experience and inevitable thought. Now will, no less than that reason which avails to render will consistent and far-reaching, animates natural bodies and expresses their functions. It has a radical bias, a foregone, determinate direction, else it cannot be a will, nor a principle of preference. The knowledge of what other people desire does not abolish a man's own aims. Sympathy and justice are simply an expansion of the soul's interests, arising when we consider other men's lives so intently that something in us imitates and reenacts their experience, so that we move partly in unison with their movements, recognize the reality and initial legitimacy of their interests, and consequently regard their aims and action, insofar as our own status and purposes have become identical with theirs. We do not less ourselves, nor less autonomous for this assimilation, since we assimilate only what is in itself intelligible, incongruous with our mind, and obey only that authority which can impose itself on our reason. The case is parallel to that of knowledge, to know all men's experience, and to comprehend their beliefs. will constitute the most cogent and subtle of philosophies. Thought would then be reasonably adjusted to all the facts of history, and judgment would grow more authoritative and precise by virtue of that enlightenment. So, too, to understand all the goods that any man, nay, that any beast or angel may ever have pursued, will leave man still necessitous of food, drink, sleep, and shelter. He would still love the comic, the loathsome, the beautiful, would still affect him with unmistakable direct emotions. His taste would no doubt gain in elasticity by those sympathetic excursions into the polyglot world. The plastic or dramatic quality which had enabled him to feel other creatures' joys would grow by exercise, and new overtones would be added to his gamut. But the foundations of his nature would stand, and his possible happiness, though some new and precious threads might be woven into it, would not have a texture fundamentally different. The radical impulses at work in any animal must continue to speak while he lives, for they are his essence. A true morality does not have to be adopted. The parts of it best practiced are those which are never preached. To be converted will be to pass from one self-betrayal to another. It will be to found a new morality on a new artifice. The morality which has genuine authority exists inevitably and speaks autonomously in every common judgment. Self-congratulation, ambition, or passion that fills the vulgar day, the pursuit of those goods which are the only possible or fitting crown of a man's life, is predetermined by his nature. He cannot choose a lawgiver nor accept one, for none who spoke to the purpose could teach him anything but to know himself. Rational life is an art, not a slavery, and terrible as may be the errors and the apathy that impede its successful exercise, the standard and the goal of it are given intrinsically. Any task imposed externally on a man is imposed by force only, but force he has the right to defy as soon as he can do so without creating some greater impediment to his natural vocation. Rational ethics, then, resembles pre-rational precepts and half-systems in being founded on impulse. It formulates a natural morality. It is a settled method of achieving ends to which man is drawn by virtue of his physical and rational constitution. By this circumstance, rational ethics is removed from the bad company of all artificial, verbal, and unjust systems of morality, which in absolving themselves from relevance to man's endowment and experience really show how completely irrelevant they are to life. Once, no doubt, each of these arbitrary systems expressed, like the observance of the Sabbath, some practical interest, or some not unnatural right. But so narrow a basis, of course, has to be disowned when the precepts so originating have been swollen into universal tyrannical laws. A rational ethics reduces them at once to their slender representative role, and it surrounds and buttresses them on every side with all other natural ideals. Rational ethics thus differs from the pre-rational in being conclusive. There is one impulse which intuitive moralists ignore, the impulse to reflect. Human instincts are ignorant, multitudinous, and contrary. To satisfy them as they come is often impossible, and often disastrous, and that such satisfaction prevents the satisfaction of other instincts, inherently no less fecund and legitimate. When we apply reason to life, we immediately demand that life be consistent, complete, and satisfactory when reflected upon and viewed as a whole. This view, as it presents each moment and its relations, extends to all moments affected by the action or maxim under discussion. It has no more ground for stopping at the limits of what is called a single life than at the limits of a single adventure. To stop at selfishness is not particularly rational. The same principle that creates the ideal of a self creates the ideal of a family or an institution. The conflict between selfishness and altruism is like that between two ideal passions. that in some particular may chance to be opposed, but such a conflict has no obstinate existence for reason. For reason, the person itself has no obstinate existence. The character which a man achieves at the best moment of his life is indeed something ideal and significant. It justifies and consecrates all his coherent actions and preferences. But the man's life, the circle drawn by biographers around the career of a particular body, from the womb to the charnel house, and around the mental flux that accompanies that career, is no significant unity. All the substances and efficient processes that figure within it come from elsewhere and continue beyond, while all the rational objects and interests to which it refers have a transpersonal status. Self-love itself is concerned with public opinion, and if a man concentrates his view on private pleasures, these may qualify the fleeting moments of his life with an intrinsic value, but they leave the life itself shapeless and infinite, as if sparks should play over a piece of burnt paper. If pleasure, because it is commonly a result of satisfied instinct, may by a figure of speech be called the aim of impulse, happiness, by a like figure, may be called the aim of reason. The direct aim of reason is harmony, yet harmony, when made to rule in life, gives reason a noble satisfaction, which we call happiness. Happiness is impossible, and even inconceivable, to a mind without scope and without pause, a mind driven by craving, pleasure, and fear. The moralists who speak disparagingly of happiness are less sublime than they think. In truth, their philosophy is too lightly ballasted, too much fed on prejudice and quibbles, for happiness to fall within its range. Happiness implies resource and security. It can be achieved only by discipline. Your intuitive moralist rejects discipline, at least discipline of the conscience, and he is punished by having no lien on wisdom. He trusts to the clash of blind forces and collision, being one of them himself. He demands that virtue should be partisan and unjust, and he dreams of crushing the adversary in some physical cataclysm. Such groping enthusiasm is often innocent and romantic. It captivates us with its useful spell, but it has no structure with which to resist the shocks of fortune which it goes out so jauntily to meet. It turns only too often into vulgarity and worldliness. The snowflake is soon a smudge, and there is a deeper purity in the diamond. Happiness is hidden from a free and casual will. It belongs rather to one chastened by a long education and unfolded in an atmosphere of sacred and perfected institutions. It is discipline that renders men rational and capable of happiness, by suppressing without hatred what needs to be suppressed to attain a beautiful naturalness. Discipline discredits the random pleasures of illusion, hope, and triumph, and substitutes those which are self-reproductive, venial, and serene, because they express an equilibrium maintained with reality. So long as the result of endeavor is partly unforeseen and unintentional, so long as will is partly blind, the life of reason is still swaddled in ignominy, and the animal barks in the midst of human discourse. Wisdom and happiness consist in having recast natural energies in the furnace of experience. Nor is this experience merely a repressive force. It enshrines the successful expressions of spirit, as well as the shocks and vetoes of circumstance. It enables man to know himself, and knowing the world, and to discover his ideal by the very ring, true or false, of fortune's coin. With this brief account, we may leave the subject of rational ethics. Its development is impossible, save in the concrete, when a legislator, starting from extant interests, considers what practices serve to render those interests vital and genuine, and what external alliances may lend them support and more glorious expression. The difficulty in carrying rational policy very far comes partly from the refractory materials at hand, and partly from the narrow range within which moral science is usually confined. The materials are individual wills naturally far from unanimous, lost for the most part in frivolous pleasures, rivalries, and superstitions, and little inclined to listen to a lawgiver that, like a new Lycurgus, should speak to them of unanimity, simplicity, discipline, and perfection. Devotion and single-mindedness, perhaps possible in the cloister, are hard to establish in the world, yet irrational morality requires that all lay activities, all sweet temptations, should have their voice in the conclave. Morality becomes rational precisely by refusing either to accept human nature as it sprouts altogether without harmony, or to mutilate it in the haste to make it harmonious. The condition, therefore, of making a beginning in good politics is to find a set of men with well-knit character and cogent traditions, so that there may be a firm soil to cultivate, and so that labor may not be wasted in plowing the quicksands